My daughter Rebecca's hands were visibly shaking as she stared at the legal documents in my attorney's office, realizing that the senile old burden she'd dumped at Sunset Manor nursing home 6 months earlier, the woman she'd told her children was too confused and expensive to care for, had just removed her kids from a $3.2 million inheritance and redirected every penny to the nursing home staff who'd shown me more kindness in 6 months than my own daughter had in 6 years. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever felt abandoned by family, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happened next completely changed how my family understands loyalty and consequences. My daughter Rebecca's hands were visibly shaking as she stared at the legal documents in my attorney's office, realizing that the senile old burden she'd dumped at Sunset Manor nursing home 6 months earlier, the woman she'd told her children was too confused and expensive to care for, had just removed her kids from a $3.2 million inheritance and redirected every penny to the nursing home staff who'd shown me more kindness in 6 months than my own daughter had in 6 years. The conversation that shattered my world happened on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered not as a family discussion, but as a business transaction that had already been decided without my input. Rebecca arrived at my house on Maple Grove Drive in Riverside Heights, with printed brochures and a clipboard full of forms, her voice carrying the tone people use when they're managing an inconvenient problem rather than talking to their mother. I'd been expecting a normal visit from my 45-year-old daughter, maybe lunch together, perhaps help with some minor household tasks, or just the kind of casual conversation we'd shared for decades. Instead, I got a corporate presentation about my future delivered with all the warmth of a real estate agent discussing property disposal. "Mom, we need to discuss your living situation," she began, setting the paperwork on my antique oak kitchen table without being invited to sit down. Her manicured fingers drummed impatiently against the glossy brochures as she arranged them in a neat row. "After careful consideration and consultations with elder care specialists, we've decided that Sunset Manor would be the best option for your safety and well-being going forward." The way she said, "we've decided," made it clear that this wasn't a conversation. It was a notification. No discussion about what I wanted, no consideration of alternatives, no acknowledgement that I might have opinions about where I lived or how I spent what could be my final years. It was as if I'd already been declared incompetent and stripped of any voice in decisions about my own life. "Rebecca, I don't understand. I'm living independently. I'm managing my own affairs. I'm not having any problems that would require assisted living. Why would I need to move to a nursing home?" I gestured around the kitchen where we sat, a room I'd kept meticulously organized and clean, where I still cooked my own meals every day, where the morning light streamed through windows I'd washed myself just the week before. Nothing about my living situation suggested decline or incapacity. "Mom, you're 78 years old, and you're living alone in a house that's too big for you to maintain safely. We're worried about falls, about you forgetting to take your medications, about what would happen if you had a medical emergency and no one was around to help." Her concern sounded rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror. But each reason she listed was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. I hadn't fallen in my house since a minor stumble in the bathroom 3 years ago that resulted in nothing more than a bruised knee. I managed my medications with a simple pill organizer system that worked perfectly, setting out each day's pills the night before and checking off each dose as I took it. I stared at my daughter, in genuine confusion. Where were these concerns coming from? "Sweetheart, I appreciate your worry, but I'm not ready to give up my independence. If you're concerned about safety, we could look into having someone check on me more regularly, or maybe hiring help for household maintenance, but I don't need institutional care." I'd actually been thriving in my independence since my husband Frank had passed away 4 years earlier. After the initial grief period, I discovered a strength and self-reliance that surprised even me. I'd learned to manage the house maintenance that Frank had always handled, developed a social network through my book club, and volunteer work at the local food bank, and maintained a level of physical activity that my doctor praised during my regular checkups. Mom, that's exactly the kind of thinking that proves you're not seeing this situation clearly. You think you're fine because you're not aware of how much your cognitive function has declined. The fact that you can't recognize the need for professional care is actually a symptom of the problem we're trying to solve. This statement hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca was suggesting that my disagreement with her plan was evidence of mental decline rather than a reasonable difference of opinion about my living situation. She was using my resistance to her decision as proof that I was incapable of making decisions for myself, a circular logic that made any protest I might offer evidence of the very incompetence she was alleging. Rebecca, my cognitive function hasn't declined. I balance my own checkbook, manage my investments, remember appointments without assistance, and maintain correspondence with friends and family. I'm disagreeing with you because I don't think nursing home placement is necessary or appropriate for my current situation. That's not confusion. That's having a different opinion than yours. I pulled out my calendar to show her the detailed notes I kept about appointments, social commitments, and household tasks. Every entry was written in my clear handwriting, with accurate dates and times. I showed her the financial records I maintained, the bills I paid on time every month, the investment statements I reviewed and understood completely. Look at this. Rebecca, does this look like the work of someone with cognitive decline? I'm managing every aspect of my life successfully. I'm not forgetting medications. I'm not missing appointments. I'm not having trouble with daily activities. What specific evidence do you have that I need professional care? Mom, everyone thinks they're fine until they're not. The families who wait until there's a crisis to make these decisions always regret not acting sooner. We're trying to be proactive and responsible about your care before something terrible happens. But I could see in her eyes that this wasn't about preventing some hypothetical future crisis. This was about something more immediate and concrete. Rebecca had been helping me with some of my financial paperwork over the past 2 years, not because I couldn't handle it, but because she'd offered to take some of the burden off my shoulders, and I'd gratefully accepted what I thought was a generous gesture from a loving daughter. Now I was beginning to understand that her help might have had motivations I'd never considered. The paperwork she'd brought included admission forms for Sunset Manor, complete with medical history sections, that had been filled out without my input. There were financial power of attorney documents that would give her complete control over my bank accounts, investments, and property. Healthcare directives that would transfer all medical decision-making authority to her, including the power to approve or deny treatments, medications, and even visitors. She wasn't asking for my permission. She was asking for my signature on decisions that had already been made. Rebecca, I'm not signing any of these documents. I don't want to move to a nursing home, and I don't want to transfer control of my finances or healthcare decisions to anyone else. I'm competent to make my own choices about my life. The expression that crossed her face was one I'd never seen before. Cold calculation mixed with frustration that her plan wasn't proceeding as smoothly as she'd expected. For a moment, the mask of concerned daughter slipped, and I saw something. That chilled me to the bone. She wasn't disappointed that I was resistant to care I might need. She was angry that I was interfering with a plan that would benefit her. Mom, if you won't voluntarily agree to appropriate care, we'll have to explore other options. I've already spoken with an elder law attorney about guardianship proceedings. It would be much easier for everyone if you'd just sign the papers and let us handle this transition smoothly. Guardianship proceedings. My own daughter was threatening to have me declared incompetent and stripped of my legal rights if I didn't voluntarily surrender my independence and move into institutional care. She was prepared to go to court and argue that I was mentally incapable of managing my own affairs, despite having no medical evidence to support such a claim. Rebecca, I can't believe you're threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent because I don't want to live in a nursing home. This isn't about my well-being. This is about your convenience. Mom, this is about accepting reality. You're going to need care eventually, and it's better to transition while you can still adapt to the change rather than waiting until there's an emergency. Besides, maintaining this house is expensive, and we need to be realistic about the financial burden your care is going to place on the family. And there it was, the real reason behind this sudden concern for my welfare. It wasn't about my safety or my cognitive function or my need for care. It was about money. Specifically, it was about the expense of supporting me in the lifestyle I'd earned through decades of hard work and careful financial planning. But as I sat there looking at my daughter, really looking at her, I realized that this conversation wasn't even about saving money on my care. This was about gaining access to money I'd spent a lifetime accumulating. The house we were sitting in was worth $850,000, a modest 4-bedroom colonial that Frank and I had bought in 1987 for $89,000 and had watched appreciate steadily as Riverside Heights became one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. My investment portfolio, built through 40 years of consistent saving and conservative investing, was worth another $2.1 million. I owned a small rental property on the other side of town that generated $1,800 in monthly income, and I had life insurance policies that would pay out substantial death benefits. Rebecca had been managing increasing portions of my finances over the past 2 years, ostensibly to help me with complicated paperwork and investment decisions. She'd convinced me that managing my portfolio was becoming too stressful for someone my age, and that she could handle the day-to-day monitoring of my accounts while I focused on enjoying my retirement. What I'd thought was a generous daughter, helping her aging mother had actually been a systematic takeover of my financial affairs, setting the stage for complete control over assets worth over $3 million. Now she wanted complete legal control over all of it, and the easiest way to get that control was to have me declared incompetent or to convince me to sign it, over voluntarily in exchange for appropriate care that I didn't actually need. Rebecca, I need you to leave now. I need time to think about what you've said, and I need to speak with my own attorney about my options. The moment I mentioned speaking with my own attorney, Rebecca's demeanor shifted from frustrated persuasion to barely concealed panic. If I consulted with independent legal counsel, her entire plan could unravel before she could execute it. Mom, there's nothing to think about, and you don't need to waste money on attorneys. The admission date at Sunset Manor is set for next Monday. I've already started the process of preparing your house for sale, and I've arranged for movers to pack your essential belongings this weekend. The words hit me like a series of physical blows. She had already set the admission date. She had already started preparing to sell my house. She had already arranged for movers. This entire conversation was a formality. She'd been planning to institutionalize me and liquidate my assets whether I agreed or not. Rebecca, you have no right to sell my house or move my belongings. I haven't agreed to any of this, and I haven't signed any documents giving you authority to make these decisions. Mom, you can't live here alone anymore, and we can't afford to maintain an empty house while paying for your care. The proceeds from the sale will help cover your nursing home expenses, and any remaining money will be put into a trust for your grandchildren's education. The mention of my grandchildren, Rebecca's twins, Michael and Sarah, who were both 15, added another layer of manipulation to her scheme. She was positioning herself as the responsible mother protecting her children's future, while I was the selfish grandmother whose stubborn independence was threatening their financial security. But the irony was staggering. I had more than enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without selling anything. The proceeds from selling my house wouldn't be needed for my care. They'd be needed to fund Rebecca's increasingly expensive lifestyle and secure immediate access to wealth she'd been counting on inheriting eventually. Over the past 2 years, as Rebecca had become more involved in my finances, I'd noticed increased spending on her part. Designer clothes, expensive vacations, a new BMW that seemed far beyond what her salary as a marketing manager should have supported. When I'd asked, Her about it casually, she'd mentioned that she and her husband David had made some good investments and were doing well financially. Now, I understood that those good investments had probably been funded by my money, accessed through the financial management role she'd convinced me to give her. Rebecca, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not moving to a nursing home. I am not signing over control of my finances to you. I am not allowing you to sell my house. And if you attempt to proceed with any of these plans without my consent, I will take legal action to stop you. For the first time in our conversation, Rebecca looked genuinely uncertain, but her response revealed just how far she was prepared to go to get what she wanted. Mom, I've already put down deposits at Sunset Manor and with the moving company. I've signed contracts based on your need for care. If you change your mind now, we'll lose thousands of dollars in non-refundable fees. She was trying to use financial pressure to force my compliance, making me feel guilty about money she'd spent without my permission on services I'd never requested. It was a masterful manipulation. She'd created financial consequences for my refusal to cooperate with her plan, then presented those consequences as evidence that I should go along with what she wanted. But what Rebecca didn't know, what she'd never bothered to discover despite 2 years of helping me with financial paperwork, was that the woman she was planning to institutionalize and financially exploit had resources, connections, and legal protections that would make her plan not just impossible, but catastrophically expensive for her to attempt. While Rebecca saw me as an aging widow whose financial affairs she could manage and whose assets she could access, the reality was far more complex. The consulting work I'd been doing since Frank's death wasn't just a way to stay busy. It was a thriving business that connected me with attorneys, financial advisors, and other professionals who respected my expertise and would be horrified to learn how my own daughter was treating me. The mother she thought she could manipulate into signing away her rights was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you underestimated someone whose only crime had been trusting their daughter to act with love rather than greed. Rebecca, I want you to leave my house now. Take your paperwork, cancel your deposits, and tell the nursing home that there's been a mistake. I will not be needing their services. Mom, you're making a huge mistake. When something happens to you, when you fall and break your hip, or forget to take your medication and end up in the hospital or have some other emergency, don't expect me to drop everything and come running. I'm trying to set up appropriate care for you now, while there's still time to do it properly. The threat was clear. Comply with her plan, or lose her support when I might genuinely need it. She was essentially holding our relationship hostage, to force my cooperation with a scheme that would benefit her financially, while isolating me from my independence, my home, and my autonomy. Rebecca, I'll take that risk. I'd rather face whatever challenges come with aging in my own home than surrender my independence to someone who sees my need for care as an opportunity for financial gain. As she gathered up her paperwork and prepared to leave, Rebecca made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Mom, I'm going to give you 48 hours to think about this. But on Friday, I'm coming back with David and the kids, and we're going to have a family meeting about your care. Maybe hearing from your grandchildren about how worried they are will help you see reason. She was planning to use my grandchildren as emotional leverage, manipulating them into expressing concerns about my welfare that would pressure me into compliance. She was going to involve 15-year-old twins in a scheme to strip their grandmother of her independence and financial autonomy. After Rebecca left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the detritus of her visit, brochures for Sunset Manor, forms I hadn't signed, and the lingering smell of her expensive perfume that seemed to mock the modest surroundings she was so eager to liquidate. For the first time in 4 years, I felt truly alone and vulnerable. Not because I couldn't manage my own affairs, but because the person I'd trusted most in the world had revealed herself to be someone capable of extraordinary cruelty in pursuit of financial gain. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to emerge. Anger. Clean, focused, empowering anger at being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Anger at having my competence questioned and my autonomy threatened. Anger at the realization that my daughter had been systematically positioning herself to exploit my eventual vulnerability. And underneath that anger, something even more powerful: determination. The woman Rebecca thought she could intimidate into. Surrendering her independence was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you underestimated someone who had spent 78 years learning how to fight for what mattered most. The mother she was planning to abandon at Sunset Manor was about to teach her a lesson about family loyalty that would cost her everything she thought she was entitled to inherit, and the grandmother she was planning to use her children to manipulate was about to show those children what real strength looked like when it was wielded by someone who refused to be a victim. I had until Friday to protect myself, my assets, and my independence from my own daughter's greed. 3 days to demonstrate that being 78 years old didn't mean being helpless, and that being someone's mother didn't mean being their victim. The woman Rebecca thought she could manipulate was about to become the woman who would ensure that cruelty and greed had consequences that lasted for generations, and it was going to be absolutely devastating. After Rebecca left that Tuesday morning, I found myself wandering through my house like a stranger, seeing each room through the lens of what she'd just tried to take from me. But more than that, I was trying to understand how the daughter I'd raised with such love and devotion could have become someone capable of such calculated cruelty. To understand how devastating Rebecca's betrayal truly was, you need to understand what our relationship had been like for the 45 years before greed transformed her into someone I barely recognized. This wasn't a case of long-standing family conflict or years of accumulated resentment. This was the complete destruction of what had been one of the most treasured relationships of my life. Rebecca Marie Walsh had been my miracle baby, born after Frank and I had tried for 8 years to have children. I was 33 when she finally arrived, old enough to appreciate every moment of motherhood, young enough to throw myself into it with boundless energy and enthusiasm. From the moment they placed her in my arms at St. Mary's Hospital, I knew that being her mother would be the most important and rewarding role of my life. Frank and I had created the kind of childhood for Rebecca that we'd both dreamed of, but never experienced ourselves. Frank had grown up with a father who worked 2 jobs and a mother who was too overwhelmed by 6 children to give individual attention to any of them. I'd been raised by loving but emotionally distant parents who believed children should be seen and not heard, and who showed affection through providing necessities rather than through engagement or involvement. We promised each other that our daughter would grow up knowing she was cherished, supported, and genuinely enjoyed by her parents. We would be the kind of parents who showed up for school plays and science fairs, who remembered the names of her friends and teachers, who took active interest in her thoughts and dreams and fears. Rebecca had thrived under that kind of attention. She'd been a bright, confident child who knew she could bring her problems to us and receive both practical help and emotional support. When she was struggling with math in 4th grade, Frank spent entire evenings at the kitchen table working through problems with her until the concepts clicked. When she was being bullied by mean girls in middle school, I helped her navigate the social dynamics while building her self-esteem and teaching her strategies for handling conflict. When she wanted to try violin in 5th grade, we rented an instrument and paid for lessons, even though the budget was tight that year. When she decided she preferred soccer to violin, we bought cleats and drove to practices twice a week without complaint. When she changed her mind again and wanted to try theater, we supported that transition too, attending every school production and helping her memorize lines. We weren't permissive parents. Rebecca had chores, curfews, and consequences for poor choices. But we were deeply involved parents who saw our job as helping her discover her talents, develop her character, and build the skills she'd need to create a successful, fulfilling life. The teenage years that destroy so many parent-child relationships had actually strengthened ours. When Rebecca was 16 and struggling with the social pressures of high school, she came to me with problems she couldn't solve alone. When she was 17 and questioning what she wanted to study in college, Frank and I helped her explore her options without pushing our own preferences. When she was 18 and nervous about leaving home, we made sure she knew that our support wasn't conditional on her staying close or choosing a path we approved of. "Mom, what if I make the wrong choice about college?" she'd asked during one of our late-night conversations in her senior year of high school. "Sweetheart, there's no such thing as a wrong choice when you're making decisions thoughtfully and with good intentions," I'd replied. "If you choose a school or a major that doesn't work out the way you hoped, you can always change direction. Your father and I will support you no matter what. But what if I disappoint you? What if I don't live up to your expectations? Rebecca, our only expectation is that you be kind, honest, and true to yourself. Everything else is just details. We're proud of you for who you are, not for what you accomplish." Those conversations had created a foundation of trust and communication that lasted well into her adult years. Even after she graduated from State University with a degree in marketing and moved to Chicago for her first job, we maintained the kind of close relationship that many parents only dream of having with their adult children. She called home twice a week, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely enjoyed talking to us. She shared details about her work, her friends, her dating life, her hopes and concerns about the future. When she was struggling with difficult roommates in her first apartment, she asked for advice about handling the situation. When she was considering a job change after 2 years with her first employer, she wanted our input about the pros and cons of different opportunities. When she started dating David Martinez during her 3rd year in Chicago, she was excited to bring him home to meet us. "Mom, I think this one might be serious," she'd said during one of our Sunday phone calls. "He's different from the other guys I've dated. He's steady and responsible, but he's also funny and kind. I think you and Dad are going to love him." We had loved David immediately. He was a software engineer with a quiet sense of humor and genuine respect for Rebecca's intelligence and ambitions. During that first visit, we'd watched him help Frank with yard work without being asked, offer to do dishes after dinner, and listen attentively when Rebecca told stories about her childhood. He clearly adored our daughter and saw her as a partner rather than an accessory to his own life. When they got engaged after dating for 2 years, Frank and I were thrilled. David was exactly the kind of man we'd hoped Rebecca would find. Someone who would support her dreams while building a stable, loving partnership with her. Their wedding in 2003 had been one of the happiest days of my life. Not because it was elaborate or expensive, it wasn't, but because it was so clearly a celebration of genuine love and commitment. Rebecca had been radiant in a simple but elegant dress we'd chosen together during a wonderful weekend of shopping and bonding. Frank had walked her down the aisle with tears of joy in his eyes. David had written his own vows that made everyone in the church cry with their sincerity and depth. I'd spent months helping Rebecca plan every detail of that wedding, and it had been a collaboration filled with laughter, shared excitement, and mutual respect for each other's opinions. When we disagreed about flowers or music or menu choices, we talked through the options until we found solutions that felt right to both of us. When the budget got tight, Frank and I quietly covered the shortfall without making Rebecca feel guilty or obligated. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done to make this wedding perfect," Rebecca had said the night before the ceremony, as we were doing final preparations at the church. "Sweetheart, seeing you this happy is all the thanks I could ever want. Your father and I are so proud of the woman you've become, and we're so grateful that David sees what a treasure he's getting." The early years of Rebecca and David's marriage had been a continuation of the close relationship we'd always shared. They lived in Chicago, about 3 hours away, but they visited regularly and stayed in close contact between visits. Rebecca called to share news about promotions at work, decorating projects for their apartment, and plans for the future. When they bought their first house in 2005, Frank and I spent a weekend helping them move and get settled. When Rebecca announced she was pregnant with twins in 2007, I thought my heart might explode with joy. Frank and I had been hoping for grandchildren, but we'd never pressured Rebecca and David about their timeline for starting a family. When the pregnancy arrived, it felt like the perfect completion of our family circle. "Mom, can you believe it?" "Twins," Rebecca had said when she called with the news. "The doctor said they're both healthy, and we should know the genders at the next appointment. David is already talking about converting the spare bedroom into a nursery." "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so excited I can barely contain myself." "Have you started thinking about names? Do you want help with nursery planning? Should I start shopping for baby clothes?" "Slow down, Mom," Rebecca had laughed. "We just found out yesterday. But yes, I'm definitely going to want your help with everything. You raised such a wonderful daughter that I figure you must know something about babies." The months leading up to the twins' birth had been a time of intense bonding between Rebecca and me. She was working full-time and feeling overwhelmed by all the decisions and preparations that came with expecting twins, so I'd offered to help research everything from car seats to cribs to pediatricians. Every weekend, I'd drive to Chicago to help with nursery preparations, attend doctor's appointments, and provide emotional support during what was an exciting but stressful time. Rebecca had severe morning sickness for the first 4 months, and I'd often arrive on Friday evenings to find her exhausted and discouraged. "I don't know how I'm going to handle taking care of 2 babies when I can barely take care of myself right now," she'd said during one particularly difficult weekend in her 5th month. "Sweetheart, you're growing 2 human beings inside your body. Of course you're tired and overwhelmed, but you're stronger than you know, and you're going to be an amazing mother. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Your father and I are here to help however you need us." When Michael David Martinez and Sarah Rose Martinez were born on March 15, 2008, I was in the delivery room holding Rebecca's hand and crying tears of joy as my grandchildren entered the world. Seeing Rebecca become a mother, watching her hold her babies for the first time, witnessing the complete transformation that came over her face when she looked at them. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced. "Mom, look at them," she'd whispered as we sat together in her hospital room later that day, each of us holding one of the babies. "They're so perfect. I can't believe they're really mine." "They're perfect because they're yours and David's," I'd replied. "You're going to give them the same kind of wonderful childhood you had, and they're going to grow up knowing how much they're loved." The first few years of the twins' lives had been a golden time for our entire extended family. Frank and I became the kind of grandparents we'd always hoped to be, deeply involved but not intrusive, generous with our time and resources but respectful of Rebecca and David's parenting decisions. We babysat regularly, so Rebecca and David could have date nights. We traveled to Chicago for every birthday, holiday, and special occasion. When the twins started walking and talking, we were there to witness and celebrate every milestone. When they developed distinct personalities, Michael serious and thoughtful, like his father, Sarah outgoing and dramatic like her mother, we delighted in getting to know each of them as unique individuals. "Mom, I don't know what we would have done without you and Dad these past few years," Rebecca had said during Christmas 2010 as we watched 2-year-old Michael and Sarah playing with the toys we'd brought them. "You've been such incredible grandparents, and having your support has made all the difference in helping us figure out this parenting thing. Rebecca, being their grandparents is one of the greatest joys of our lives. We love spending time with them, and we love seeing what wonderful parents you and David have become." When Frank was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer in 2011, Rebecca had been incredibly supportive and involved in his treatment decisions. She'd driven down from Chicago every weekend during his radiation treatments, bringing the twins, so he'd have something positive to focus on during a difficult time. "Dad, "You have to get better," 4-year-old Sarah had announced during one of those visits, climbing onto Frank's lap with the fearless confidence of a beloved grandchild. "Grandpa has to be here for my wedding someday." "I'll do my best, sweetheart," Frank had replied, holding her close and winking at me over her head. "I wouldn't miss your wedding for anything." Frank's recovery had been complete and relatively easy, but the experience had reminded all of us how precious our time together was. Rebecca had started calling more frequently, visiting more often, and making sure the twins had plenty of opportunities to build memories with their grandfather. When Frank died suddenly of a heart attack in 2019, Rebecca had been my rock during the most difficult period of my life. She'd taken a week off work to help plan the funeral, coordinate with relatives, and make sure I wasn't alone during those first horrible days of widowhood. "Mom, you don't have to make any big decisions right now," she'd said as we sat in my kitchen the day after Frank's funeral, surrounded by casserole dishes from neighbors and flower arrangements from friends. "Just focus on getting through each day, and let me handle the logistics and paperwork. I don't know how to live without him, Rebecca. We were partners in everything for 42 years. I don't know who I am without being Frank's wife. You're my mother, and you're Michael and Sarah's grandmother, and you're a woman who has so much love and wisdom to offer the world. Dad wouldn't want you to stop living just because he's gone. He'd want you to find ways to be happy and fulfilled, even without him." During those first months of grief, Rebecca had called every day, visited every weekend, and included me in family activities so I wouldn't feel isolated or forgotten. When I'd expressed interest in doing some volunteer work to fill the empty hours, she'd helped me research opportunities and drove me to interviews. When I'd mentioned that I might like to do some consulting work to supplement my income and give myself a sense of purpose, Rebecca had been enthusiastic and supportive. "Mom, you have so much experience in business and finance. I bet there are lots of small companies that could benefit from your expertise. And it would be good for you to have a reason to get dressed up and interact with people during the week." For the first 2 years after Frank's death, Rebecca had been exactly the daughter any grieving mother would hope for. Attentive without being suffocating, helpful without being controlling, supportive without being patronizing. She'd treated me like a competent adult who was dealing with a major life transition, not like an elderly person who needed to be managed and protected. When had that started to change? Looking back, I could see that the shift had begun sometime in late 2021, about 2.5 years after Frank's death. Rebecca had started making subtle comments about my living situation, my financial management, and my ability to handle various aspects of independent living. "Mom, this house is really big for just one person," she'd mentioned during a visit in November 2021. "Have you ever thought about downsizing to something more manageable?" "Not really, sweetheart. I love this house, and Frank and I put so much work into making it exactly what we wanted. I'm not ready to leave all those memories behind. I understand the emotional attachment, but from a practical standpoint, maintaining a 4-bedroom house seems like a lot of work and expense for someone living alone." At the time, I'd dismissed her comment as casual conversation rather than the beginning of a campaign to convince me that my living situation was inappropriate. But now I could see that she'd been testing the waters, seeing how receptive I might be to suggestions about major life changes. The comments had become more frequent and more pointed over the following months. Rebecca had started questioning my driving, my medication management, my social activities, and my financial decisions. Each concern was presented as loving worry rather than criticism, but the cumulative effect was to plant seeds of doubt about my competence and independence. "Mom, are you sure you should be driving to the grocery store in the evening? The roads are more dangerous after dark, especially for people our age." "Rebecca, I'm 76. Not 96. My vision is fine, my reflexes are good, and I've been driving safely for 60 years. I think I can handle a trip to the store." "I know you think you're fine, but accidents happen so quickly. It would be terrible if something happened to you that could have been prevented by being more cautious." The shift in our relationship had been so gradual that I hadn't recognized it as manipulation until Rebecca showed her true intentions that Tuesday morning in March. What I'd interpreted as a daughter's natural concern for her aging mother had actually been a systematic campaign to undermine my confidence and prepare me for the kind of control she was now trying to impose. But remembering the 43 years of genuine love and mutual respect that had preceded this transformation made Rebecca's betrayal even more devastating. This wasn't a relationship that had always been troubled or conflicted. This was the destruction of one of the most treasured bonds of my life by someone I'd loved unconditionally since the moment she was born. The daughter who was now trying to have me declared incompetent and strip me of my independence was the same person I'd rocked to sleep as a baby, helped with homework as a child, supported through teenage heartbreaks, celebrated with during college graduation, walked down the aisle at her wedding, and held hands with during childbirth. The woman who was threatening guardianship proceedings if I didn't comply with her demands was the same person who had called me her best friend, who had sought my advice on major decisions, who had trusted me to help raise her children, and had gratefully accepted my support during the most challenging periods of her adult life. The mother who was planning to use my grandchildren as emotional leverage to force my compliance was the same person who had said, just 5 years earlier, that having my support had made all the difference in helping her figure out parenting. Sitting in my kitchen that Tuesday evening, surrounded by the remnants of Rebecca's visit, I felt like I was mourning the death of a relationship that had been one of the defining features of my identity for 45 years. The daughter I'd raised and loved was gone, replaced by someone whose capacity for cruelty I was only beginning to understand. But as the grief settled into something deeper and more permanent, I realized that remembering who Rebecca used to be, or who I'd thought she was going to be crucial for what came next. Because the woman who was trying to steal my independence and assets had made one critical miscalculation. She'd forgotten that the mother she was trying to manipulate was the same person who had successfully raised her to be confident, strategic, and resourceful. The skills I'd used to guide Rebecca through childhood challenges, support her through adult transitions, and help her build a successful life were exactly the skills I'd need to protect myself from the woman she'd chosen to become. And the love I'd poured into creating the foundation of her character was about to become the source of my own strength as I fought to preserve everything she was trying to take from me. The golden past we'd shared hadn't been a lie, even if her current behavior suggested otherwise. It had been real, and valuable, and transformative, for both of us. But now it was also going to be my roadmap for survival. Because if I'd been capable of raising a daughter who could plan and execute something this calculated and manipulative, then I was certainly capable of outmaneuvering her when my own freedom and dignity were at stake. The foundation we'd built together was about to become the weapon I'd use to protect myself from the woman she'd chosen to become, and Rebecca had given me 45 years of training for this fight, even if she didn't realize it yet. After spending Tuesday evening reflecting on the beautiful relationship Rebecca and I had shared for 4 decades, I found myself compelled to understand exactly when and how that relationship had been systematically destroyed. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a carefully orchestrated campaign spanning nearly 2 years, so subtle and gradual that I'd failed to recognize it as manipulation until it was almost too late. Looking back with the clarity that comes from having your eyes brutally opened, I could now see that Rebecca's campaign to reposition me from beloved mother to problematic burden requiring management had begun in earnest during Thanksgiving weekend of 2021. Approximately 2.5 years after Frank's death. At the time, I'd attributed the shift in Rebecca's behavior to natural concern about my adjustment to widowhood and independent living. What I now understood was that she'd been conducting a systematic assessment of my vulnerability, testing my boundaries, and laying the groundwork for the kind of control she would eventually try to impose. The first warning sign had come during what should have been a joyful family gathering. Rebecca, David, and the twins had come to spend Thanksgiving weekend with me, something that had become our tradition since Frank's death. I'd been looking forward to the visit for weeks, planning menus, preparing guest rooms, and organizing activities that would create special memories for 13-year-old Michael and Sarah. But instead of the warm, relaxed family time we'd always enjoyed, that weekend had felt like being subjected to a comprehensive evaluation of my competence and lifestyle. "Mom, when was the last time you had your eyes checked?" Rebecca had asked on Thursday evening, as I was serving dessert after our Thanksgiving dinner. "I noticed you seemed to be squinting a bit while you were reading the recipe earlier." I'd been surprised by the question. My vision was fine. I'd had my annual eye exam just 3 months earlier and received a clean bill of health from Dr. Patterson, the same ophthalmologist I'd been seeing for over a decade. But Rebecca's tone suggested she'd observed something concerning that I wasn't aware of myself. "I had my annual exam in August, sweetheart. Dr. Patterson said my vision is excellent for someone my age. I may have been squinting because the print on that recipe card was smaller than usual, but my eyesight is fine." "Are you sure?" "Because vision changes can happen quickly as we age, and it's important to stay on top of them for safety reasons." The phrase, "as we age," had stood out to me because Rebecca had never spoken to me that way before. She'd never categorized me as someone whose age was a defining factor in my capabilities or limitations. But I'd dismissed it as casual conversation, rather than the beginning of a pattern. The questions had continued throughout the weekend, each one presented as loving concern, but cumulatively creating a portrait of someone whose competence was questionable, and whose independence might be at risk. "Mom, have you been having any trouble remembering to take your medications?" she'd asked on Friday morning, after noticing my pill organizer on the kitchen counter. "No, Rebecca. I use that organizer to make sure I take everything at the right times. It's actually a very effective system for staying organized. But don't you worry about forgetting to refill it each week? It seems like it would be easy to make mistakes with multiple medications. I'd been taking the same 3 medications for over 5 years. Blood pressure medication, a daily vitamin, and a calcium supplement. Hardly a complex pharmaceutical regimen that would challenge anyone's organizational skills. But Rebecca's questions made it sound like I was managing a complicated medical protocol that might be beyond my capabilities. "Rebecca, I've been managing my own medications successfully for decades. I think I can handle 3 pills a day." "I know you think you can handle it, Mom, but medication errors are one of the leading causes of hospitalizations for people in your age group. It might be worth considering some kind of system that provides additional safety measures." There it was again. People in your age group. As if being 76 automatically placed me in a category of people who couldn't be trusted to manage basic aspects of their own care. The weekend had continued with similar exchanges about my driving habits, my housekeeping standards, my social activities, and my financial management. Each conversation had been framed as concern for my well-being, but the cumulative effect had been to plant seeds of doubt about my competence in every area of independent living. "Mom, this house is really big for just one person," Rebecca had mentioned on Saturday afternoon, as we were cleaning up after lunch. "Have you thought about whether it makes sense to maintain so much space when you're only using a few rooms?" "I use every room in this house, Rebecca. I have my office in the spare bedroom, I entertain friends in the living room, I work on projects in the basement, and I enjoy having space for family when you visit. This isn't too much house for me. It's exactly the right amount of house for the life I want to live. But Mom, the maintenance costs must be significant. Property taxes, utilities, upkeep. It all adds up. And if something happened to you, a smaller place would be much easier for the family to manage." If something happened to me? The phrase had sent a chill through me, though I hadn't fully understood why at the time. Rebecca was already thinking about how my living situation would affect her convenience if I became incapacitated or died. She wasn't concerned about my current happiness or comfort. She was planning for scenarios where my preferences would no longer matter. "Rebecca, I can afford to maintain this house comfortably, and I love living here. The maintenance isn't a burden, and I'm not ready to downsize just to make things more convenient for other people. I'm not talking about convenience, Mom. I'm talking about being realistic about what's sustainable as you get older. That weekend had established the template for every interaction Rebecca and I would have over the following 18 months. Every conversation would include subtle questioning of my judgment, gentle suggestions that my current lifestyle wasn't appropriate for someone my age, and careful documentation of any minor forgetfulness or physical limitation that could be interpreted as evidence of decline. The campaign had escalated during my 77th birthday celebration in January 2022. Rebecca had insisted on hosting a small party at her house in Chicago, ostensibly to save me the trouble of entertaining. But what should have been a joyful celebration had felt more like a performance review, with Rebecca monitoring my behavior for signs of cognitive or physical deterioration. "Mom, you seem to be having trouble following the conversation tonight," she'd said privately during the party, after I'd asked someone to repeat a question I hadn't heard clearly in a noisy room. "Rebecca, there are 12 people here talking at once, and I didn't hear what Jim said because Michael and Sarah were laughing loudly at the same time." That's not hearing loss. That's normal difficulty following conversations in crowded spaces. "But Mom, it happened twice tonight. And last time you visited, you seemed confused about some of the stories the kids were telling you." I'd been genuinely puzzled by this assessment. I hadn't been confused about anything the twins had told me. I'd asked clarifying questions because I was interested in their stories and wanted to understand the details. Since when had active listening become evidence of cognitive decline? "Rebecca, asking questions about things people tell me isn't confusion, it's engagement. I ask questions because I care about what Michael and Sarah are sharing with me, not because I'm unable to follow what they're saying. Maybe, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on. Sometimes cognitive changes are subtle at first, and family members are often the first to notice." She was positioning herself as the vigilant daughter who was responsibly monitoring my mental state, while I was cast as the potentially declining mother who might not be aware of her own limitations. Any question I asked, any request for clarification, any normal human moment of inattention could be reframed as evidence that my cognitive function was deteriorating. The financial manipulation had begun during that same period, presented as helpful assistance with increasingly complex paperwork and investment management. In February 2022, Rebecca had offered to help me organize my tax documents and coordinate with my accountant. "Mom, tax preparation is getting more complicated every year, especially for people with investment income like you. Why don't you let me gather all your documents and work with Harold to make sure everything is filed correctly?" Harold Brennan had been preparing my taxes for over 15 years. He knew my financial situation intimately and had never indicated that my tax preparation was particularly complex or challenging. But Rebecca's offer had seemed generous, and I'd appreciated having one less administrative task to manage. What I hadn't realized was that helping with my taxes would give Rebecca access to comprehensive information about my assets, income, and financial management strategies. She'd spent hours reviewing my investment statements, bank records, and insurance policies under the guise of helping Harold prepare accurate returns. "Mom, I had no idea you were doing so well financially," she'd commented after reviewing my documents. "Your investment portfolio has really grown since Dad died. Your father and I were careful savers, and I've been fortunate with my investment choices. Harold has been excellent at helping me manage everything. But Mom, managing investments is getting more complicated as the markets become more volatile. Are you sure Harold's approach is still appropriate for someone in your situation?" There. It was again, someone in your situation. The implication that my age, widowhood, or some other factor meant that investment strategies that had worked successfully for years might suddenly be inappropriate or risky. "Rebecca, my portfolio has performed very well under Harold's guidance. I'm comfortable with our approach, and I see no reason to make changes." "I'm not suggesting major changes, Mom. but it might be worth having someone review your overall financial strategy to make sure you're protected against market volatility and that your assets are structured appropriately for estate planning. Purposes: estate planning. She was already thinking about how my assets would be distributed after my death and positioning herself as the responsible family member who was looking out for everyone's interests. Over the following months, Rebecca had gradually inserted herself into more and more aspects of my financial management. She'd offered to help with online banking setup, investment account monitoring, and bill payment organization. Each offer had been presented as assistance that would reduce my stress and ensure that important tasks weren't overlooked. Mom wouldn't. It'd be easier if I had online access to your accounts so I could help you monitor everything. That way, if there are any problems or unusual transactions, I can catch them quickly and alert you. Rebecca, I check my accounts regularly, and I've never had any problems with unauthorized transactions. My bank has excellent security measures, and I'm comfortable managing my own monitoring. But Mom, financial fraud targeting seniors is becoming more and more common. Having a family member with access to your accounts provides an extra layer of protection. The phrase fraud targeting seniors had been particularly insidious. Rebecca was suggesting that my age made me a natural target for financial predators, and that I needed her protection to avoid being victimized. She was positioning herself as my guardian against external threats, while simultaneously becoming the primary threat to my financial autonomy. By the summer of 2022, Rebecca had established herself as my unofficial financial advisor, with access to most of my accounts and detailed knowledge of my investment portfolio. She'd convinced me that this arrangement was protecting me from potential problems while reducing my administrative burden. What I hadn't understood was that this access was giving her the information she needed to plan the kind of comprehensive financial takeover she would eventually attempt. The social isolation campaign had begun around the same time, with subtle suggestions that my friendships and activities might not be appropriate for someone in my situation. Mom, are you sure it's safe to be driving to book club meetings in the evening? Rebecca had asked in June 2022, after I'd mentioned looking forward to our monthly discussion of that summer's selection. Rebecca, book club meets at 7 p.m., which is hardly late evening. And the community center is less than 3 miles from my house on roads I've driven thousands of times. I know you're comfortable with the route, but evening driving can be challenging even for younger people. And if something happened to your car, you'd be stranded. If something happened to my car, I'd call AAA, just like any other driver would. Rebecca, I've been driving safely for 60 years. I think I can handle a trip to book club. Maybe, but wouldn't it be easier to find activities that meet during the day? There are lots of senior programs that would be more convenient and probably more appropriate for people your age. Senior programs. Activities more appropriate for people your age. Rebecca was trying to redirect me away from the intellectually stimulating book club I'd enjoyed for over 8 years towards senior programs that would reinforce her narrative about my declining capabilities and social needs. Rebecca, I don't want to join senior programs. I want to continue participating in activities with people who share my interests, regardless of their age. Book club includes women from their 30s to their 80s, and I enjoy the diverse perspectives and stimulating conversations. But Mom, don't you think you'd be more comfortable with people who are dealing with similar life circumstances? Other widows, or people who are retired and have more time for socializing? She was trying to convince me that I belonged in age-segregated activities with other seniors, rather than maintaining the diverse, stimulating friendships I'd built over decades of community involvement. She wanted me to see myself as someone whose primary identity was elderly widow, rather than engaged community member. The campaign had intensified during the fall of 2022, with increasingly frequent expressions of concern about every aspect of my independent living. Rebecca had started calling twice a week instead of once, always with questions about my health, safety, or decision-making that reinforced the narrative of decline and vulnerability. Mom, I've been thinking about your living situation, And I'm worried about what would happen if you had a medical emergency, she'd said during one of these calls in October. Rebecca, I have a medical alert system. I live in a neighborhood with helpful neighbors, and I'm in regular contact with my doctor. If I had a medical emergency, I'd receive appropriate care just like anyone else would. But Mom, response times can be critical in medical emergencies, especially for people with pre-existing conditions. And if you were unconscious or unable to communicate, paramedics might not have access to your medical history. I'd been in excellent health for someone my age, with only the minor conditions, controlled blood pressure and early arthritis, that were normal for people in their late 70s. But Rebecca was catastrophizing about hypothetical medical emergencies as if my current health status made such crises inevitable and imminent. Rebecca, I'm not living in denial about the possibility of future health problems, but I'm also not going to restructure my entire life around worst-case scenarios that may never happen. I'm not asking you to restructure your life, Mom. I'm just suggesting that we should have plans in place for situations that are statistically likely to occur. Statistically likely to occur. Rebecca had started using language that made my aging sound like a medical condition with predictable stages of decline, rather than a natural process that could involve years or even decades of continued health and independence. The most insidious aspect of her campaign had been the way she'd started involving David and the twins in her narrative about my declining capabilities and increasing need for supervision. David is concerned about you too, Mom, she'd mentioned during a November phone call. He thinks it might be time to start having family conversations about long-term planning. What kind of long-term planning? Planning for scenarios where you might need more support or assistance? Making sure everyone knows what your preferences are for different kinds of care? And making sure we have the legal documentation in place to help you if you become unable to make decisions for yourself. Legal documentation. Rebecca was already thinking about power of attorney arrangements and healthcare directives that would transfer decision-making authority to her. She was planning for my incapacity as if it were an inevitable short-term development, rather than a possible distant future scenario. Rebecca, I appreciate the family's concern, but I'm not ready to plan for incapacity that may not occur for many years, if at all. When and if I need assistance with decision-making, I'll seek appropriate legal advice about my options. But Mom, the time to create these documents is while you're still competent to make clear decisions about your preferences. If you wait until you actually need them, it might be too late. The underlying message was clear. My current competence was temporary and fragile, and we needed to act quickly to establish legal protections before my inevitable decline made such planning impossible. By December 2022, Rebecca had successfully established herself as the primary authority on my needs, capabilities, and appropriate living arrangements. Every conversation included references to concerns she'd discussed with David, worries that had been expressed by the twins, or professional advice she'd sought about managing elderly parents. Mom, I talked to a geriatric care manager about the best ways to support aging parents, and she said that family members often wait too long to address safety concerns because they're worried about hurting their parents' feelings. A geriatric care manager. Rebecca had been consulting with professionals about managing me as if I were already a patient rather than an autonomous adult who was capable of making my own decisions about my care and living situation. Rebecca, I don't need management by a geriatric care specialist. I'm managing my own life successfully, and I'll seek professional guidance if and when I decide I need it. But Mom, that's exactly what the care manager said would happen. She said that people in early stages of decline often don't recognize their own limitations, and that families need to be proactive about providing support before crises occur. Early stages of decline. Rebecca was now explicitly categorizing me as someone who was experiencing cognitive or functional deterioration, despite having no medical evidence to support such an assessment. The financial pressure had increased dramatically during the winter of 2023, with Rebecca expressing growing concern about my spending habits, investment choices, and overall financial management. Mom, I've been reviewing your bank statements, and I noticed you spent quite a bit on holiday gifts last year, she'd said during a January phone call. Are you sure that level of spending is sustainable on a fixed income? I'd spent approximately $800 on Christmas gifts for the entire extended family. Hardly an extravagant amount for someone with my financial resources. But Rebecca was framing normal holiday generosity as evidence of poor financial judgment and unsustainable spending patterns. Rebecca, my holiday spending was well within my budget, and my income isn't actually fixed. Between my investment returns, rental property income, and consulting fees, I have substantial financial flexibility. But Mom, consulting income can be unpredictable, and you shouldn't be depending on earned income at your age. It would be more appropriate to live within the limits of your retirement savings and Social Security. More appropriate for someone my age. Rebecca was trying to convince me that continuing to work, even part-time consulting that I enjoyed and that supplemented my income, was somehow inappropriate for someone in their late 70s. Rebecca, I enjoy my consulting work, and the income allows me to maintain the lifestyle I want without touching my retirement savings. There's nothing inappropriate about continuing to work as long as I'm capable and willing. But Mom, what happens if your health changes and you can't work anymore? Wouldn't it be smarter to adjust your spending now so you're not dependent on income that might disappear? She was asking me to voluntarily reduce my standard of living based on hypothetical future scenarios where I might be unable to work. She wanted me to start living like an invalid before there was any medical reason to do so. The most devastating aspect of Rebecca's campaign had been the way she'd gradually poisoned my relationship with my grandchildren by involving them in her narrative about my declining capabilities and increasing need for supervision. Grandma, Mom says you've been having trouble remembering things, 14-year-old Sarah had said during a visit in February 2023. Are you okay? I'd been shocked that Rebecca had been discussing my supposed memory problems with the twins. There were no memory problems. I'd been having normal moments of forgetfulness that every human being experiences, regardless of age. Sweetheart, I'm fine. Sometimes I forget small things, like where I put my reading glasses or what I plan to pick up at the store. But that's normal for everyone. Your mom is just worried about me because she loves me. But she said we should start calling you more often to check on you, and that we should let her know if we notice you seem confused about anything. Rebecca had recruited my own grandchildren to monitor me for signs of decline and report their observations back to her. She'd turned what should have been natural, loving relationships into surveillance operations designed to gather evidence for her narrative about my incompetence. Sarah, I love talking to you and Michael anytime you want to call, but you don't need to check on me like I'm a patient. I'm your grandmother, and I'm doing just fine. Okay, Grandma, but if you ever need help with anything, you'll tell us. Right? The fact that a 14-year-old was asking if I needed help suggested that Rebecca had been preparing the twins for scenarios where their grandmother might require assistance with basic tasks. She was conditioning them to see me as someone whose independence was temporary and fragile. By the spring of 2023, Rebecca had successfully created a family consensus that I was experiencing decline and would soon need intervention to ensure my safety and well-being. Every family gathering included discussions about my driving, my living situation, my financial management, and my overall capacity for independent living. The conversations weren't presented as planning sessions. They were presented as loving, family members expressing natural concern about a cherished relative who might not be fully aware of her own limitations. Mom, we're all just worried about you, Rebecca had said during Easter dinner. You seem to be struggling with things that used to be easy for you, and we want to make sure you get the support you need before something serious happens. Rebecca, I'm not struggling with anything. I'm living independently, managing my own affairs, and enjoying my life. What specific struggles are you referring to? Well, you seemed confused about the directions to the restaurant last week. And you forgot to mention that you'd changed your hair appointment when we were trying to coordinate schedules. Getting clarification about directions to a restaurant I'd never been to before wasn't confusion. It was normal caution about navigating to an unfamiliar location. Forgetting to mention a schedule change wasn't memory loss. It was a minor oversight that happens to everyone. But Rebecca had reframed both incidents as evidence of cognitive decline that warranted family concern and potential intervention. The systematic nature of her campaign had become clear to me only in retrospect, as I sat in my kitchen Tuesday evening trying to understand how our relationship had been so completely transformed. For 18 months, Rebecca had been carefully documenting every minor forgetfulness, every request for clarification, every normal sign of aging, and reframing all of it as evidence that I was becoming incapable of managing my own life. She'd gradually isolated me from friends and activities that might contradict her narrative, inserted herself into my financial management, involved other family members in monitoring my behavior, and created a comprehensive case for why I needed the kind of intervention she was now trying to impose. The nursing home ultimatum hadn't been a sudden decision. It had been the inevitable conclusion of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to strip me of my autonomy and give Rebecca complete control over my assets and decision-making. But as I reconstructed the timeline of her manipulation, I realized that Rebecca had made one critical error in her planning. She'd assumed that the woman she was trying to control was actually as vulnerable and incompetent as she'd been claiming I was. The mother she thought she could manipulate was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you systematically underestimated someone whose only crime had been trusting her daughter to act with love rather than greed. And the woman she'd spent 18 months trying to convince everyone was about to show her what real strategic thinking looked like when it was wielded by someone who finally understood the true nature of the battle she was fighting. As I continued to piece together the systematic nature of Rebecca's campaign against my independence, one of the most manipulative aspects became crystal clear. She hadn't been operating in a vacuum. Every criticism of my lifestyle, every suggestion that my choices were inappropriate for someone my age, every argument for why I needed more supervision had been supported by carefully chosen examples of how other families handled elderly parents more appropriately. Rebecca had created a false standard against which my situation was constantly measured, a composite picture of ideal elderly parent management that made my desire for independence seem selfish, unrealistic, and potentially dangerous. This wasn't just about her opinion versus mine. It was about positioning herself as the responsible daughter who understood best practices for elder care, while I was cast as the stubborn elderly woman who was refusing appropriate guidance. Primary example Rebecca had used to illustrate proper family dynamics was David's relationship with his own parents, Carlos and Maria Martinez, who lived in a senior living community about an hour outside of Phoenix. According to Rebecca's carefully crafted narrative, the Martinez family represented everything that was healthy, realistic, and responsible about managing aging parents. You know, Mom, David's parents made the transition to assisted living 3 years ago, and they're so much happier now, Rebecca had mentioned during one of her phone calls in early 2022. They realized that trying to maintain their house was becoming too much work, and they found a beautiful community where they can focus on enjoying their retirement instead of worrying about maintenance and safety. At first, I'd been interested in hearing about how David's parents were adjusting to their living situation. I'd met Carlos and Maria several times over the years at family gatherings, and I'd found them to be lovely people who seemed devoted to their family and committed to staying active in their retirement. That's wonderful that they found a place they're happy with, I'd replied. How old are they now? Carlos is 82 and Maria is 79, so they're a few years older than you. But they made the move while they were still healthy and capable of making good decisions about their care. David says that waiting until there's a crisis is one of the biggest mistakes families make. The implication was clear. At 76, I was approaching the age where responsible people made proactive decisions about transitioning to institutional care. The Martinez family had been smart enough to plan ahead, while I was stubbornly clinging to independence that would inevitably become unsustainable. Rebecca, it sounds like assisted living was the right choice for them, but that doesn't mean it's the right choice for everyone. Different people have different needs and preferences for how they want to live. But Mom, that's exactly what David's family thought at first. Maria was really resistant to the idea of leaving her house, but once she made the transition, she realized how much stress she'd been carrying about maintenance and safety. Now she says she wishes they'd made the move sooner. Over the following months, Rebecca had returned to the Martinez family example repeatedly, each time adding new details that reinforced her narrative about appropriate choices for aging parents. David talked to his father yesterday, and Carlos mentioned how grateful he is that they don't have to worry about yard work anymore, she'd said during a spring 2022 conversation. He said he used to spend hours every weekend on lawn care and garden maintenance, and now he can spend that time on activities he actually enjoys. That's great for Carlos, but I happen to enjoy working in my garden. It's not a burden for me. It's one of my favorite ways to spend time outdoors. I know you think you enjoy it, Mom, but is it really enjoyable? Or is it something you feel obligated to do because you've always done it? There's a difference between activities that bring genuine pleasure and activities that feel like responsibilities you can't abandon. Rebecca was suggesting that my love of gardening wasn't actually genuine, that I was maintaining my garden out of some sense of obligation rather than authentic enjoyment. She was implying that I couldn't distinguish between pleasurable activities and burdensome responsibilities, which was another subtle way of questioning my judgment and self-awareness. Rebecca, I genuinely enjoy gardening. It's meditative, it gives me a sense of accomplishment, and it connects me with nature in ways that are important to my well-being. I'm not maintaining my garden because I feel obligated. I'm maintaining it because it brings me joy. But Mom, what happens when the physical demands become too much for you? Wouldn't it be better to transition to a lifestyle that doesn't depend on your ability to do heavy outdoor work? Again, she was asking me to plan for hypothetical future limitations rather than living according to my current capabilities and preferences. The Martinez family model required proactive surrender of activities and independence before there was any actual need to do so. The financial comparison had been particularly insidious. According to Rebecca's narrative, David's parents had made smart financial decisions by transitioning to assisted living before their expenses became unmanageable. Mom, David mentioned that his parents' housing costs are actually lower now than they were when they were maintaining their house, Rebecca had said during a summer 2022 conversation. When you factor in property taxes, utilities, maintenance, insurance, and all the other expenses of homeownership, assisted living is actually more economical for them. That may be true for their situation, but my housing costs are manageable, and I'm not ready to give up my home to save money I don't need to save. But Mom, it's not just about current costs. It's about protecting your assets for the future and making sure you don't outlive your money. David's parents feel more secure knowing that their housing costs are predictable and that they're not at risk of major unexpected expenses. She was framing my continued home ownership as financially irresponsible, suggesting that I was putting my future security at risk by maintaining a lifestyle that might become unsustainable. The Martinez family's choice to prioritize financial predictability over housing preferences was presented as obviously superior to my choice to prioritize lifestyle preferences over cost optimization. Rebecca, I have sufficient resources to maintain my current lifestyle comfortably for the foreseeable future. I'm not going to restructure my living situation based on worst-case financial scenarios that may never materialize. But Mom, that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people into trouble. David's parents planned for scenarios where their expenses might increase or their income might decrease, and now they're protected against those possibilities. The social aspects of the Martinez comparison had been equally manipulative. Rebecca had consistently portrayed David's parents as people who had found community and purpose through institutional living, while implying that my preference for aging in place was socially isolating and potentially harmful to my mental health. David's mom was telling me about all the activities they have at their community, Rebecca had mentioned during a fall 2022 phone call. They have exercise classes, book clubs, game nights, educational lectures. There's always something interesting happening. Maria says she's more socially active now than she's been in years. That sounds wonderful for Maria. I'm glad she's found activities she enjoys. But I already have a book club, volunteer commitments, and social activities that I find fulfilling. But Mom, those activities require you to drive to different locations, coordinate with multiple schedules, and manage your own transportation. Wouldn't it be easier to have everything available in one place, where you don't have to worry about logistics? Easier was Rebecca's code word for more appropriate for someone with diminished capabilities. She was suggesting that my current social activities were too complex and demanding for someone my age, and that I should transition to a more managed social environment where my limitations would be accommodated. Rebecca, I don't want easier. I want engaging. I want to continue participating in activities with people who share my interests, even if that requires some logistical coordination. But what happens when driving becomes unsafe, or when you're not feeling well enough to get out? At David's parents' community, there are backup social options available even when they're not able to participate in their usual activities. She was asking me to plan for scenarios where I might be unable to drive or participate in normal activities, and suggesting that institutional living provided better contingency planning for those possibilities. The healthcare comparison had been perhaps the most frightening aspect of Rebecca's manipulation. She'd consistently portrayed the Martinez family's access to on-site medical care as obviously superior to my reliance on community healthcare providers. David mentioned that his father had a minor health scare last month, but it was handled so efficiently because there's medical staff right on site, Rebecca had said during a winter 2023 conversation. Carlos was able to get immediate attention without having to wait for an ambulance or worry about getting to the hospital. I'm glad Carlos received prompt care, but I have excellent relationships with my doctor, and I live in a community with responsive emergency services. I'm confident that I would receive appropriate medical attention if I needed it. But Mom, response times matter in medical emergencies, especially for people with underlying health conditions. And what if you had an emergency when you couldn't communicate effectively? At David's parents' community, the staff knows everyone's medical history and can provide accurate information to healthcare providers. Rebecca was catastrophizing about medical emergencies as if they were inevitable and imminent, while positioning institutional care as the only responsible way to prepare for such possibilities. She was implying that my decision to age in place was putting my health and safety at risk in ways that demonstrated poor judgment about my own well-being. Rebecca, I have a medical alert system, and my doctor has complete records of my health history. I'm not living without appropriate medical safety measures, but those measures depend on your ability to use them effectively. What if you're unconscious or confused or unable to operate the alert system? At an assisted living community, there are multiple backup systems to ensure that medical needs are identified and addressed quickly. She was suggesting that my medical safety measures were inadequate because they required my own cognitive and physical participation. The Martinez model provided better protection because it didn't depend on my continued competence to function effectively. But perhaps the most manipulative aspect of Rebecca's use of the Martinez family as a standard was the way she'd enlisted David himself to validate her narrative about appropriate elder care choices. David was saying yesterday that he's so grateful his parents made the transition to assisted living before they absolutely needed it, Rebecca had mentioned during one of our phone calls. He said watching them adapt to community living while They were still healthy made him realize how much easier the transition is when it's planned, rather than forced by circumstances. Having David express gratitude for his parents' choices created the impression that adult children naturally felt relieved when their parents made responsible decisions about aging. By implication, Rebecca was frustrated with me because I was refusing to make the kind of choices that would allow her to feel similarly grateful and relieved. Rebecca, I'm sure David appreciates knowing that his parents are comfortable and well cared for, but different families make different choices, based on their own circumstances and preferences. But Mom, David also says that he wishes more elderly parents were as realistic and proactive as his parents were. He thinks a lot of families wait too long and end up dealing with crises that could have been prevented with better planning. David was being positioned as the voice of reason, the adult child who understood best practices for managing aging parents and who appreciated when those parents made appropriate choices. Rebecca was aligning herself with David's supposed expertise while positioning me as the difficult parent who was refusing to accept professional guidance. The most insidious aspect of this dynamic was that I had no way to verify whether David actually held these opinions or whether Rebecca was fabricating his perspectives to support her own agenda. I couldn't very well call David and ask him directly about his views on elder care without seeming like I was questioning Rebecca's honesty or creating family conflict. But based on my own interactions with David over the years, his supposed focus on elder care best practices seemed out of character. David had always been respectful and supportive of my independence, and he'd never expressed concerns about my living situation or lifestyle choices. The David that Rebecca described, someone who was constantly evaluating and judging elderly parents' decisions, didn't match the thoughtful, accepting man I'd known for over 15 years. Rebecca had also used other families in our community as negative examples, cautionary tales about what happened when elderly parents made poor choices or when adult children failed to intervene appropriately. Did you hear about what happened to Margaret Thompson's mother? Rebecca had asked during a spring 2023 phone call, referring to my book club friend whose 84-year-old mother lived independently across town. No. What happened? She fell in her kitchen and lay there for 6 hours before anyone found her. Margaret feels terrible because she'd been worried about her mother living alone, but she didn't want to push the issue because her mother was so resistant to getting help. The implication was clear. Margaret had failed in her responsibility as a daughter by not overriding her mother's preferences and forcing her into a safer living situation. The fall was presented as the inevitable consequence of allowing an elderly parent to maintain independence despite family concerns. That's terrible that she was injured. I hope she's recovering well. She's okay. But Mom, this is exactly what I worry about with you. Margaret's mother insisted she was fine living alone, just like you do. But look what happened. If Margaret had been more assertive about getting her mother appropriate care, this accident could have been prevented. Rebecca was using Margaret's mother's accident as evidence that my own independence was dangerous, and that Rebecca would be negligent if she didn't intervene to protect me from similar risks. Rebecca, accidents can happen anywhere. People fall in assisted living communities too. Living independently doesn't automatically make someone more accident-prone. But Mom, when accidents happen in care communities, there's immediate help available. Margaret's mother could have died from exposure or dehydration because no one knew she was hurt. She was catastrophizing about my living situation by focusing on worst-case scenarios while ignoring the safety measures I'd put in place and the community connections that provided regular contact with friends and neighbors. Rebecca had also used professional sources to validate her position, citing articles, studies, and expert opinions that supported her narrative about appropriate elder care choices. I was reading an article in AARP magazine about the warning signs that elderly parents need more support, she'd mentioned during one of our conversations. It said that family members are often the first to notice changes in cognitive function or physical capabilities, even when the elderly person doesn't recognize the changes themselves. Professional validation made Rebecca's concerns seem objective and evidence-based, rather than personal opinions or family preferences. She was positioning herself as someone who was informed about elder care best practices, while I was cast as someone who was ignorant about my own needs and limitations. Rebecca, I'm sure there are warning signs that indicate when people need additional support, but those signs need to be based on actual evidence of decline, not on theoretical possibilities or worst-case scenarios. But Mom, the article said that elderly people often have limited insight into their own capabilities, especially in the early stages of cognitive decline. Family members need to be proactive about identifying problems before they become serious. She was using professional sources to support the argument that my own assessment of my capabilities was inherently unreliable, while her assessment, despite having no medical training or geriatric expertise, was more trustworthy and objective. False standard that Rebecca had created wasn't just about comparing me unfavorably to other families. It was about establishing a framework where any choice other than voluntary surrender of independence was inherently irresponsible, selfish, and potentially dangerous. According to Rebecca's narrative, responsible elderly parents recognized their limitations and made proactive transitions to managed care. Loving adult children provided guidance and oversight to help their parents make appropriate choices. Healthy families worked together to ensure that aging was handled safely and efficiently. By contrast, my desire to continue living independently was evidence of poor judgment. My resistance to Rebecca's suggestions demonstrated lack of insight into my own limitations. My preference for autonomy over security showed that I was prioritizing my own stubborn preferences over my family's legitimate concerns. The false standard had been so carefully constructed and consistently reinforced that even I had begun to question whether my perspective was reasonable. Maybe Rebecca was right that I was being stubborn and unrealistic. Maybe other families did handle aging more responsibly. Maybe I was putting my own preferences ahead of legitimate safety concerns. But as I reconstructed Rebecca's manipulation tactics, I realized that the standard she'd created was fundamentally dishonest. She'd presented selective information about other families while omitting details that might contradict her narrative. She'd attributed opinions to David that may not have reflected his actual views. She'd used professional sources to support predetermined conclusions rather than to genuinely explore different approaches to aging. Most importantly, she'd created a false choice between independence and safety, between autonomy and responsibility, between personal preferences and family harmony. According to Rebecca's framework, I couldn't be both independent and safe, both autonomous and responsible, both true to my preferences and considerate of my family's concerns. But the reality was that successful aging could take many different forms, depending on individual circumstances, preferences, and capabilities. The Martinez family's choice to transition to assisted living might be perfect for them while being completely inappropriate for me. Margaret's mother's accident was a single incident that didn't necessarily indicate broader patterns about the safety of independent living. Rebecca had weaponized the experiences of other families to make me feel like my own choices were aberrant and dangerous. She'd used selective professional information to create the impression that expert opinion universally supported her position. She'd enlisted family members and community examples to build a consensus that my resistance to her suggestions was unreasonable and potentially harmful. The false standard had been designed to make me feel isolated in my perspective, like I was the only person who didn't understand the obvious need for the changes Rebecca was proposing. It had been intended to create social pressure for compliance while making continued resistance seem selfish and irresponsible. But now that I understood the manipulation for what it was, I could see that Rebecca had made a critical error in her strategy. She'd spent so much energy creating false comparisons and manufactured consensus that she'd never actually addressed the fundamental question: what did I want for my own life, and what was I realistically capable of achieving? The woman she'd been trying to convince that she was out of step with normal family practices was about to demonstrate that normal practices weren't necessarily appropriate practices for every individual situation. The mother she'd been comparing, unfavorably to other families, was about to show her what happened when you tried to impose other people's solutions on someone whose circumstances and preferences were fundamentally different. And the grandmother she'd been using professional sources to pathologize was about to teach her a lesson about the difference between evidence-based decision-making and conclusion-driven manipulation. Rebecca thought she'd been building an airtight case for why I needed to accept her guidance and surrender my independence. What she'd actually been doing was providing me with a detailed blueprint of her manipulation tactics and a clear understanding of exactly how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. The false standard she'd created was about to become the foundation for my own strategic response, a response that would demonstrate the difference between genuine care and manipulative control, between appropriate concern and systematic exploitation, and it was going to be absolutely devastating. As I sat in my kitchen that Tuesday evening, surrounded by the remnants of Rebecca's failed manipulation attempt, something powerful began to emerge from my anger and hurt: clarity. For the first time in 18 months, I could see our family dynamic with perfect, devastating precision. Rebecca had built her entire campaign on a fundamental miscalculation. She had no idea who she was actually trying to control. While Rebecca saw me as a vulnerable elderly widow whose finances she'd been helping to manage, the reality was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous to her plans. The consulting work I'd been doing since Frank's death wasn't the small-scale retirement hobby she imagined. Walsh Strategic Consulting had become one of the most respected boutique business advisory firms in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in family-owned enterprises, succession planning, and exactly the kind of elder care decision-making that Rebecca thought she understood. My client list read like a directory of the region's most successful business families. I'd spent 5 years helping them navigate precisely the situations Rebecca was trying to create: adult children seeking to gain control of aging parents' assets, family members using concern trolling to justify financial manipulation, and elderly parents protecting themselves from exploitation by their own relatives. What Rebecca didn't know was that her 78-year-old mother had become the go-to expert for wealthy families dealing with elder care exploitation. I'd seen every manipulation tactic she was using, helped dozens of families expose similar schemes, and developed foolproof strategies for protecting vulnerable adults from financial predators, even when those predators were their own children. The irony was exquisite. Rebecca had spent 18 months positioning herself as the expert on elder care while trying to manipulate someone who was literally the professional expert on preventing elder care manipulation. But more than professional expertise, I had resources that would make Rebecca's head spin. The financial picture she thought she understood from helping with my taxes represented only a fraction of my actual wealth. While she knew about my investment portfolio and the house, she had no idea about the business accounts, the professional, real estate investments, or the cash reserves I'd built through 5 years of commanding premium consulting fees. Walsh Strategic Consulting had generated over $2.8 million in revenue since Frank's death. My client retainer fees alone averaged $15,000 to $25,000 per month. I owned commercial real estate in 3 states, held silent partnerships in 2 thriving businesses, and maintained investment accounts that Rebecca had never seen because they were held under my business entity rather than my personal name. The woman Rebecca thought was living on a fixed income and needed to be realistic about expenses was actually worth over $8.3 million and earning more annually than Rebecca and David combined. But most importantly, I had connections that could destroy Rebecca's plan with a single phone call. Wednesday morning, I began what would become the most satisfying professional project of my career. dismantling my daughter's scheme with the same precision and thoroughness I'd used to help dozens of other families protect themselves from elder care fraud. My first call was to Patricia Sinclair, the most ruthless elder law attorney in the state, and a personal friend who'd been referring clients to me for 3 years. Patricia specialized in cases where adult children attempted to exploit aging parents, and she had a particular talent for turning predators into defendants. Patricia, I need your help with a situation that's both personal and professional. Eleanor, what's happening? My daughter is attempting to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized so she can gain control of my assets. She's scheduled what she thinks is my admission to a nursing home for Monday, and she's threatened guardianship. Proceedings if I don't comply. The silence on Patricia's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Eleanor, please tell me you've documented everything. Every conversation, every threat, every financial transaction she's made using access I gave her to help with paperwork. I have 18 months of evidence showing systematic manipulation and financial positioning. Eleanor, your daughter just handed you the perfect elder abuse case. By Monday, she's going to understand exactly what happens when someone tries to exploit an elderly parent who happens to be a professional expert in preventing elder care exploitation. Patricia's plan was beautiful in its simplicity and devastating in its precision. We would allow Rebecca to proceed with her nursing home timeline, but every step of her plan would be documented by professionals she didn't know existed. When Rebecca arrived at Sunset Manor on Monday with her paperwork and her mother in tow, she would discover that her intended victim had been 3 steps ahead of her from the beginning. My second call was to Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the geriatrician, who'd been conducting comprehensive cognitive assessments for my clients for the past 4 years. Dr. Harper specialized in documenting the competence of elderly adults who were facing inappropriate intervention from family members. Dr. Harper, I need a complete geriatric assessment that demonstrates my cognitive and functional competence. Eleanor, given your professional work, I assume this is related to someone questioning your capacity? My daughter is threatening guardianship, proceedings based on alleged cognitive decline that exists only in her imagination. I can have a complete assessment completed by Friday, including cognitive testing, functional evaluation, and medical clearance. When this is finished, no court in the country would question your competence to make your own decisions. Dr. Harper's assessment would provide ironclad medical documentation that I was not only competent, but performing at levels that exceeded normal ranges for my age group. Rebecca's claims about my declining capabilities would be revealed as fabricated nonsense, contradicted by professional medical evaluation. My third call was to James Mitchell, the private investigator who'd helped me document financial exploitation for several client families. James specialized in following money trails and documenting unauthorized financial activity. James, I need a complete forensic analysis of financial transactions made by someone with limited power of attorney access to my accounts. Eleanor, are we talking about unauthorized spending? We're talking about someone who's been using access to my accounts to fund their own lifestyle while positioning themselves to claim financial guardianship. How far back do you want me to go? 2 years. I want every transaction, every transfer, every expenditure that wasn't explicitly authorized. I want to know exactly how much of my money has been funding my daughter's attempt to steal the rest of my money. James's investigation would provide detailed documentation of Rebecca's financial misconduct. Every unauthorized expenditure, every suspicious transfer, every indication that she'd been using my accounts as her personal piggy bank would be thoroughly documented and quantified. But the most important call I made was to Michael and Sarah. Directly. Grandma, Sarah answered on the second ring. Mom said you might not be feeling well. Are you okay? The genuine concern in my 15-year-old granddaughter's voice nearly broke my heart. Rebecca had been manipulating these children, turning them into unwitting accomplices in her scheme to exploit their grandmother. Sweetheart, I'm feeling fine, but I need to ask you something important. Has your mother been talking to you about my health or my living situation? Yeah. She said you might need to move somewhere where there are people to help take care of you. She said we should spend time with you now because you might not remember us as well later. The cruelty was breathtaking. Rebecca had been preparing her own children for their grandmother's supposed cognitive decline, poisoning their relationship with me while setting them up to support her narrative about my incompetence. Sarah, your mother has been telling you things about my health that aren't true. I'm not developing memory problems, and I'm not going to forget you, but I need you and Michael to know that there are some serious problems happening in our family right now. What kind of problems? The kind of problems that happen when someone lies about other people to get what they want. Sarah, I want you and Michael to come stay with me this weekend. I have some things to show you that will help you understand what's really been going on. When I called Michael separately, his response was even more telling. Grandma, Mom said you called her and were confused about why she was trying to help you. She said you didn't remember agreeing to move to the place with the nurses. Rebecca had been manufacturing conversations, telling the twins that I'd agreed to nursing home placement, and then forgotten about it. She was using my supposed memory problems to explain why I was resistant to plans I'd supposedly approved. Michael, I never agreed to move anywhere, and I never had any conversation with your mother about nursing home placement that I later forgot. Your mother has been lying to you about my health and my decisions? But why would Mom lie about something like that? Because, sweetheart, sometimes people do terrible things when they want something badly enough. And your mother wants something that belongs to me. Friday afternoon, Patricia arrived at my house with documentation that would make Rebecca's guardianship threats look like the amateur manipulation they were. We spent 3 hours reviewing every aspect of Rebecca's scheme, documenting every threat she'd made, and preparing the legal response that would protect me from any future attempts at financial exploitation. Eleanor, by the time we're finished, your daughter will be facing potential criminal charges for attempted elder abuse, Patricia said, as she organized the evidence we'd assembled. But more importantly, she'll never be able to threaten your autonomy again. Dr. Harper's assessment results were even more satisfying than I'd hoped. Not only did they document my complete cognitive and functional competence, but they revealed that my performance on standardized tests exceeded the normal range for people 20 years younger than me. Eleanor, these results would be impressive. For someone in their 50s, Dr. Harper said as she reviewed my scores. No court in the country would question your capacity based on this evaluation. Your daughter's claims about cognitive decline are not just wrong, they're absurdly wrong. James's financial investigation was the final piece of evidence I needed to demonstrate exactly what Rebecca had been doing with access to my accounts. Over 18 months, she'd made unauthorized withdrawals totaling $47,000, always in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but large enough to fund significant improvements to her lifestyle. Eleanor, this is a textbook case of financial exploitation, James said, as he showed me the detailed accounting of Rebecca's unauthorized spending. She's been systematically draining your accounts while building a case for why she should have legal control over them. But the most important preparation for the weekend was setting up the living room for the conversation I needed to have with Michael and Sarah. I arranged chairs where we could sit comfortably together, prepared the documents that would help them understand what had been happening, and steeled myself for the heartbreaking task of explaining how their mother had been manipulating them. When the twins arrived Friday evening, they seemed nervous and uncertain. Rebecca had clearly prepared them for the possibility that their grandmother might seem confused or upset about things that weren't real. Grandma, are you feeling okay? Michael asked as they settled into the living room. Mom said you might be having some problems with memory and thinking clearly. Michael, I want you and Sarah to look at these test results, I said, handing them Dr. Harper's assessment. This is from a comprehensive evaluation I had done by a doctor who specializes in testing elderly people's mental abilities. Sarah studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd inherited her grandmother's analytical skills. Grandma, These scores are really high. This says you performed better than most people your age. That's right, sweetheart. The doctor said my cognitive function is excellent, and there's no evidence of any memory problems or confusion. So when your mother tells you that I'm having trouble thinking clearly, she's not telling you the truth. Michael looked confused and distressed. But why would Mom say you were having problems if you weren't? Because, Michael, your mother wants something that belongs to me, and the easiest way to get it is to convince everyone that I'm not capable of making my own decisions. I spent the next 2 hours showing them the evidence I'd assembled. The key? Financial records that documented Rebecca's unauthorized spending, the timeline of her manipulation campaign, the threats she'd made about guardianship proceedings, the false narratives she'd created about my health and capabilities. Grandma, this makes Mom look like a criminal, Sarah said after reviewing the financial documentation. Sarah, what your mother has been doing is criminal. Taking money from elderly people without permission is a crime called financial exploitation. Threatening to have competent adults declared incompetent is a crime called elder abuse. But she's our mom, Michael said, tears starting to form in his eyes. Why would she do something like this to you? I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know that what she's been doing is wrong, and I won't let her continue doing it. The most difficult part of the conversation was explaining how Rebecca had been manipulating them as part of her scheme. Your mother has been asking you to monitor me for signs of confusion or decline, and then using your responses to support her claims that I need supervision, I explained. She's been turning you into witnesses against me without you realizing what was happening. The questions about whether you seemed confused, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. Mom always asked us if you seemed to understand what we were talking about, or if you repeated yourself, or if you seemed lost. And when you gave normal answers about normal interactions, your mother interpreted them as evidence that I was declining. You were being manipulated into providing false testimony about my capabilities. By Sunday evening, Michael and Sarah understood exactly what their mother had been planning, and exactly how she'd been using them to support her scheme. They were angry, hurt, and determined to help protect their grandmother from someone they were struggling to recognize as their mother. Grandma, what's going to happen to Mom? Michael asked as we finished dinner Sunday night. I don't know yet, sweetheart. That depends on whether she continues trying to implement her plan or whether she realizes that what she's been doing is wrong and stops. What's going to happen to us? Sarah asked. You're going to be fine. No matter what happens. Between your mother and me, you're still my grandchildren, and I will always love you and want you in my life. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity and perfect weather. The kind of day that makes dramatic revelations feel like destiny rather than coincidence. Rebecca arrived at my house at exactly 9 a.m., accompanied by David and armed with a folder full of documents she expected me to sign. Mom, I hope you've had time to think about what we discussed, Rebecca said as she arranged her paperwork on the kitchen table. The admission appointment at Sunset Manor is at 11 a.m., and we need to review the financial authorizations before we go. Rebecca, please sit down. We need to have a conversation. Mom, there's no time for conversation. We have a schedule to keep, and delaying this transition any longer isn't fair to anyone. Rebecca, there isn't going to be a transition. I'm not going to Sunset Manor. I'm not signing your documents. And I'm not allowing you to continue the financial exploitation you've been conducting for the past 18 months. The words hit the room like a physical force. Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold anger that revealed exactly who she'd become. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Dr. Harper's evaluation shows that you're competent to make decisions, but that doesn't mean you're making good decisions. Rebecca, Dr. Harper's evaluation shows that I'm not only competent, but performing at exceptional levels for someone my age. Your claims about my cognitive decline are completely fabricated. I handed her a copy of Dr. Harper's assessment. Rebecca scanned the document with growing alarm as she realized that her fundamental premise, my supposed incompetence, had been professionally contradicted. "This doesn't change anything," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Cognitive testing doesn't measure judgment or decision-making ability." "Actually, it does. And James Mitchell's financial investigation measures something else entirely. Your unauthorized use of my money to fund your lifestyle while planning to steal the rest of my assets." I handed her James's forensic accounting report. The color drained from Rebecca's face as she saw the detailed documentation of $47,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, transfers, and expenditures. "Mom, that money was for helping you manage your affairs. You authorized me to handle financial transactions on your behalf." "Rebecca, I authorized you to help with bill paying and investment monitoring. I never authorized you to transfer money to your personal accounts, pay for your family's vacations, or fund your car payments." David, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Rebecca, what is she talking about? What financial transactions?" Rebecca's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as she realized that David had no idea about the financial misconduct she'd been engaging in while building her case for my incompetence. "David, your wife has been stealing money from my accounts while telling you that she was helping me manage my finances," I explained. "She's taken nearly $50,000 without authorization while planning to gain legal control over the rest of my assets." "Rebecca, is this true?" David asked, his voice tight with disbelief and growing anger. "It's not stealing when someone has power of attorney," Rebecca said desperately. "I was managing Mom's money to protect her from making poor financial decisions." "Rebecca, you had limited power of attorney for specific bill-paying purposes. You never had authority to transfer money to your own accounts or make personal expenditures using my funds." But the most devastating revelation was still to come. "Rebecca, there's something else you don't know about my financial situation," I said, pulling out the documentation that would destroy her scheme completely. "The assets you know about represent only a fraction of my actual wealth." I handed her Walsh Strategic Consulting's financial statements for the past 5 years. Rebecca stared at the documents in growing shock as she realized that her supposedly declining elderly mother was actually worth over $8 million and earning more annually than she and David combined. "Mom, what is this? You told me. You were doing small consulting projects to stay busy." "Rebecca, I told you I was consulting. You assumed it was small-scale retirement activity because you never bothered to ask for details. Walsh Strategic Consulting is one of the most successful boutique advisory firms in the region. But this says you made over $600,000 last year alone." "That's correct. And this year's revenue is tracking even higher." David was staring at his wife with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Rebecca, you told me your mother was struggling financially and needed our help managing her expenses." "I never said she was struggling," Rebecca protested weakly. "I said she needed help managing complex financial decisions." "Rebecca, you said she was living on a fixed income and that maintaining her house was becoming a financial burden," David replied, his voice rising with anger and disbelief. But the final blow was delivered when Patricia Sinclair arrived at exactly 10 a.m., accompanied by a court reporter and 2 additional witnesses. "Mrs. Martinez," Patricia said formally, addressing Rebecca, "I'm Patricia Sinclair, representing your mother in response to your threats of guardianship proceedings and your attempted financial exploitation." Rebecca looked like she was about to faint. "What do you mean, financial exploitation?" "I mean that you've committed multiple felonies in your attempt to gain control of your mother's assets. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud are all serious criminal charges that carry substantial prison sentences." "But I'm her daughter. I was trying to help her." "Mrs. Martinez, attempting to have a competent adult declared incompetent for financial gain is a crime regardless of your family relationship. Your mother has more legal protections and financial resources than you apparently realized." The court reporter began documenting everything that followed. Rebecca's desperate attempts to justify her actions, David's horrified reactions to learning what his wife had been planning, and my formal statement declining all of Rebecca's unauthorized financial arrangements. But the most satisfying moment came when Michael and Sarah arrived, as we'd arranged, to witness the conclusion of their mother's scheme. "Mom, what's happening?" Sarah asked as she took in the scene. Legal professionals, financial documents, and her mother looking like she was facing the collapse of everything she'd planned. "Your mother has been caught trying to steal from your grandmother," David said, bluntly. Everything she told us about Grandma's health and financial situation was a lie. Michael looked at his mother with a combination of disappointment and betrayal that was devastating to witness. "Mom, you said Grandma was sick and needed help? But she's not sick, and you were trying to take her money." Rebecca's final desperate gambit was an attempt to cast herself as the victim of a vindictive elderly woman who was punishing her daughter for trying to provide appropriate care. "She's making this sound criminal, but I was trying to protect her from making poor decisions with money she can't afford to lose," Rebecca said, gesturing at the financial documents. "I was trying to ensure that her assets were preserved for the family." "Rebecca," I said quietly, "you were trying to steal my independence, my home, and my assets while convincing everyone that I was incompetent. The only family you were preserving anything for was yourself." The legal resolution was swift and comprehensive. Patricia filed restraining orders that prevented Rebecca from accessing any of my accounts, properties, or personal information. The unauthorized financial transactions were reported to both civil and criminal authorities. Rebecca's limited power of attorney was revoked, and she was permanently banned from any involvement in my financial affairs. But more importantly, the truth about our family dynamic was now documented and undeniable. Rebecca could never again claim that her actions had been motivated by appropriate concern for my well-being. Everyone who mattered, David, the twins, extended family, and legal professionals, understood exactly what she had attempted and exactly why it was wrong. The impact on Rebecca and David's marriage was immediate and severe. David moved out that week, taking the twins with him while he decided whether their marriage could survive the revelation that his wife was capable of such calculated cruelty towards someone who had loved and supported her unconditionally. "I don't know who I've been married to," David said during a private conversation we had the following weekend. "The woman I thought I knew would never have tried to exploit her own mother this way." The twins chose to live primarily with their father, while maintaining a relationship with their mother that would forever be changed by their understanding of what she'd been capable of planning. "Grandma, will you forgive Mom?" Sarah asked during one of our conversations after the legal proceedings concluded. "Sweetheart, forgiveness is complicated. I can forgive your mother for the pain she caused me, but I can never trust her the way I used to. And trust is what makes family relationships possible. But the most significant change was in my own life and priorities." The woman Rebecca had tried to convince everyone was declining and incompetent used the experience to expand her consulting business into a new specialty, helping elderly adults protect themselves from financial exploitation by family members. "Eleanor, you've created the most comprehensive elder care protection program I've ever seen," Patricia said, as we reviewed the legal strategies I developed based on my own experience. "This is going to help thousands of families prevent the kind of exploitation you faced." 6 months later, Walsh Strategic Consulting had a waiting list of elderly clients who wanted protection from manipulative adult children. I'd written articles for professional publications about family financial exploitation, spoken at conferences about elder care abuse prevention, and become the go-to expert for attorneys handling similar cases. The irony was perfect. Rebecca's attempt to destroy my independence had led to the expansion of my professional success and the creation of legal protections that would prevent other families from experiencing what we'd been through. 1 year after Rebecca's failed nursing home scheme, I made the final adjustment that would ensure her actions had lasting consequences. During a meeting with my estate planning attorney, I formally removed Rebecca from my will and redirected her inheritance to a foundation supporting elder care abuse prevention. Michael and Sarah's inheritance remained intact, held in trusts that would provide for their education and future needs, while ensuring that Rebecca could never access or control those funds. The woman who tried to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized will receive exactly what she deserves from my estate, I told my attorney. Nothing. The letter I sent to Rebecca explaining the change was brief and precise. Rebecca, your systematic attempt to exploit my supposed vulnerability while planning to steal my independence and assets has had permanent consequences. The daughter who tried to convince everyone that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs will discover that I was competent enough to ensure that cruelty and greed have lasting costs. Your children will be well provided for through trusts that protect them from your poor judgment. You will receive nothing, because people who try to steal from their parents deserve nothing. I hope the $47,000 you stole was worth losing a $3 million inheritance. Rebecca's response was exactly what I expected. A mixture of rage, self-pity, and desperate attempts to convince other family members that I was being vindictive and unreasonable. But the documentation of her scheme was comprehensive and undeniable. Everyone who reviewed the evidence understood that my response was proportionate and justified. Rebecca had gambled everything on her ability to manipulate and control her supposedly declining mother, and she'd lost everything when that mother turned out to be far more capable and resourceful than she'd ever imagined. Today, at 79, I continue to live independently in the house Rebecca tried to force me to sell. I work with clients who value my expertise and pay premium fees for strategies that protect their autonomy and assets. I maintain friendships and activities that provide intellectual stimulation and social fulfillment. Most importantly, I've learned that the greatest threat to elderly adults often comes not from strangers or institutions, but from family members who see aging as an opportunity for financial gain, rather than a natural process that deserves respect and support. The daughter who tried to teach me about appropriate boundaries and realistic expectations learned that there are consequences for mistaking someone's love for weakness, someone's trust for vulnerability, and someone's age for incompetence. Michael and Sarah, now 16, understand that real family loyalty means protecting each other from exploitation, not enabling it. They've learned that love isn't about control or management. It's about respect, support, and the recognition that people deserve to make their own choices about how they want to live. Grandma, do you ever regret what happened with Mom? Sarah asked during a recent visit. Sarah, I regret that your mother chose greed over love and manipulation over respect. But I don't regret protecting myself from someone who was willing to destroy my independence for financial gain. Do you think she's learned anything from what happened? I think she's learned that underestimating people based on their age or circumstances can be a very expensive mistake. The woman Rebecca dismissed as a declining elderly burden who needed management turned out to be the person who would teach her the most expensive lesson of her life about the consequences of elder care exploitation, and that lesson will last for generations. At the end of the day, the only thing Rebecca accomplished was proving that being someone's daughter doesn't give you the right to steal their independence, and that 78 years of life experience includes learning how to fight back when someone tries to make you a victim. The nursing home bed she'd reserved for me remained empty. The independence she'd tried to steal remained intact. The money she'd counted on inheriting went to people who deserved it more, and the mother she'd thought she could manipulate became the grandmother who made sure that justice had the final word. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is ensuring that the consequences match the crime, and that the people who try to exploit love and trust learn exactly what those attempts cost. Rebecca learned, and she'll remember that lesson for the rest of her life. That's the end of our story. If this resonated with you, please subscribe and share your own experiences with family manipulation in the comments. And remember, sometimes the people who underestimate you provide the perfect opportunity to show them exactly who they were dealing with all along.